This conference will now be recorded.
So the webinars that we're doing, and this is number 6 so far, are recorded, and the recordings will be available through YouTube and a link through the My Forever Family website. So you can access the material again later and listen all over again if you should so inclined. Normally we have Alex on to do a little My Forever Family intro. She will lead us today. So I will just say hi on behalf of both myself and My Forever Family, and welcome you to number 6 of our webinar series so far. So this one today is about top tips for therapeutic parenting, and I'm going to give you a little introduction to what therapeutic parenting is and some ideas about why we use therapeutic parenting as well. So we're recorded today. I'll go through for about 50 minutes and then have some time towards the end for questions. So if you've got anything, there'll be free questions towards the end, but please do feel free to use the chat panel on the panel on your screen to ask any questions as we go on. I'm really happy to answer them as I go through. Otherwise, it feels kind of like a bit of a one-way conversation. So do use the chat panel. Otherwise, we can have more of a talk at the end. We're expecting 20 people on today that have registered, and we're up to about 15 now. So hopefully some more people will join us as we go through the presentation this morning. So over the last few weeks, we have been talking about a whole range of things. We've talked about developmental trauma as well in a couple of the webinars, but as you can well imagine, everything kind of links to everything else, and all of this information is a little bit of a nebulous of connected ideas. So I thought this morning I would just recap a little on developmental trauma and the brain, because this is what actually informs the work that we're doing and the reason why we use the therapeutic parenting approach. Okay, so developmental trauma is the term used to describe the impact of early repeated abuse, neglect, separation, and adverse experience that happens within a child's importance relationships. So this is not only their experiences of any kind of abusive behaviour, neglect, being a witness or a victim of violence, but it's also the connection that they make in that primary relationship with their primary attachment relationship. It can start from within utero. So current research is from 16 weeks of pregnancy, cortisol can cross the placenta. So in utero, cortisol levels, if mum is particularly stressed, so if she is a victim of violence or if she's using drugs or excessive alcohol, by any kind of stress at all, means her cortisol levels are going up, and when her cortisol levels goes up, then that's actually crossing the placenta, so it's exposing the unborn infant to stress already. Bullying in school and grief or loss of loved ones or friends, these are important, but in terms of developmental trauma, they need to occur prior to the age of 6, and it's usually about the important relationships. So whilst this is on the slide here, I'm not quite as convinced, because developmental trauma really is a relational impact and impacting that child's not only ability to grow and their brain's ability to grow, which I'll just move on to that one, but also that particular important relationship. So the attachment relationship is not about how much the parent or caregiver loves the child. It's about the parent or caregiver's ability to keep that child safe, because reflecting back on some of that, the early webinars we've had so far, we've talked about the brain, and if we go back to that hand model and the brain stem, being the early part to be built. This is all of the physical regulation, breathing, sleeping, all of those things happen down here. And then the amygdala is right in the middle here. So the amygdala, remember, is the smoke detector of the brain. And the attachment relationship is the part that goes over the smoke detector called the cingulate, which through that comfort and joy and keeping a child safe is like the off switch for that smoke detector. So in developmental trauma, we're not developing an off switch, and so to speak, and also not developing that capacity for regulation. So over, I think, webinars 1 and about 3, we talked about regulation, co-regulation, and there's this little flow chart here that can give you a bit of a flow about what we develop first. So from emotional regulation, we want behavioural regulation, and then we're getting right up to that cognition that's coming up in the top part of the brain development. And then, of course, once all of this is integrated, we're developing that self-concept and identity, which we hope that our children are developing a sense of self, and as they hit to their teenage years, then also the sense of identity. Okay. So what is therapeutic parenting? Therapeutic parenting is a deeply nurturing parenting style with a foundation of self-awareness and central core of mentalization developed from consistent, empathic, insightful responses to a child's distress and behaviours, allowing the child to begin to self-regulate, develop an understanding from their own behaviours, and ultimately form secure attachments. So that sounds particularly amazing, and it also sounds like you have to be particularly amazing to be able to do that 24/7. So whilst, you know, we really want to aim to be therapeutic parents, do understand that this is something, it's really hard, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally and can take a fair bit of work. So therapeutic parenting is really, it can be described as compensating children for what they missed out on when they're in their parents' care, and or from their early caregivers. And it's to help with that subsequent level of disruption in development and also in developing their attachment. The primary characteristics of therapeutic parenting are routine, consistency, acceptance, and containment. So routine, I think we always talk about routine. We always talk about how important routine is for children anyway. When we're raising little people, having a clear routine so they know what they're doing is so important. Consistency, and consistency is not just about the routine and doing the same thing the same time, but having the same response to the same things all of the time. So for the little people that we're working with and you're caring for, they haven't had consistent responses to their behaviour. So they might do something. If mum or dad have had mental health problems, one day it might have been okay, the next day it could have been the beginning of an argument, it could have been the beginning of yelling, or there may have been a significant consequence for what the child wasn't prepared for. So because they've had all of that inconsistency, the importance of being consistent and having consistent responses is integral to that healing process. It's also about acceptance and containment. And when I talk about acceptance, I'm going to talk about it a bit today, and it does link over with Dan Hughes's PACE model, which we'll have another look at today, is about accepting the child for who they are, them as an individual and being an important little human in our universe and important to everyone's well-being. And containment is about that boundary setting. So having a clear understanding and expectation of what's going to happen in a particular environment is really good for children. Also, this relationship, therapeutic parenting relationship, will have critical aspects of the emotional relationship. So offering love, nurturance, security and belonging to your particular family environment is also critical. It's based on building safe, strong relationships that combine affection and comforting along with clear behavioural expectations and routines. So when we do talk about things like connection before correction, it doesn't mean that we're not putting any limits in or letting things go. It just means that we're coming from another angle to do that first. So this approach also assists children to challenge the negative internal working models of their relationships and then begin to experience relationships differently. So in that sense, we need caregivers to really understand why and where the behaviours are coming from and why they might be behaving in a particular way to be able to respond to those behaviours. Okay, so I've got a whole list of common behaviours here that are fairly usual, I guess. Particularly, so fear may be disguised in the meltdown or yelling and screaming or something like that. Lack of cause and effect thinking. So if we think about cause and effect thinking, we develop this generally about heading into school age. So we talk about the terrible twos and sometimes the terrible threes because kids haven't really developed rationalization then. And rationalization comes when we think about this hand model. It comes when we're developing those two hemispheres of the brain. So we need a nice brain stem, we need a nice limbic system, and then as we're building the top bits, the important bits for the thinking, this is where the cause and effect thinking comes from. So if we don't have the stable base and we don't have stability in the next layer in the limbic system, there's going to be difficulty in developing that lack of cause and effect thinking. So, so if we think about when we're talking with children with developmental trauma, cause and effect thinking, we think about that terrible twos behaviour. I want something now. It's often characteristic in older children. So hypervigilance is another one, and over the last few weeks in the other webinars we've talked about the window of tolerance, and hypervigilance fits into that top layer outside the window or sitting on the top of the window waiting and looking for danger. An impacted internal working model. So we talk about our internal working model is that kind of set of neurons, our neurobiology that helps us make sense of the world. So our internal working model knows how to respond to certain situations based on our own experience of those certain situations. So if a fire alarm goes off, we immediately think, oh, there's a fire. Our internal working model goes, okay, so we need to follow the person in the hat or hold hands and leave the building together. Because our internal working model is set up to understand this. We've been trained multiple times when we're not stressed. So at the point that the stress occurs, we should have the information in our internal working model to go ahead with the procedure that we've been taught to do when we are under stress. So this applies to everything. We have an internal working model for our relationships. So if we experienced a warmth in a caregiver relationship, we learn warmth in caregiver relationships. And if we didn't experience warmth, it's very hard to learn that. But that's our internal working model. It's how we respond to any situation in the universe. Up the top here, being unable to reattune. So we read each other And I think Dan Siegel is another researcher and psychiatrist, I believe. He has quite a lot of material available if you're in that space. And he talks about the me and the you, and what sits in between us is the we. And between me and between you, how we read what's going on in the we is made up from our own two stories. So I can look at you, if only I could look at you today, that would be really lovely. And I can read the behaviour on your face, or I can read thoughts or feelings on your face, and then that gives me a cue as to how I behave then to maintain the we in between us. So for children with developmental trauma, after escalation, or if their internal system has been dysregulated, they may be unable to then read the cues from you to then come back into the relationship of the we. So it impacts their ability to read others. Usually the cues that they read very quickly are the micro expressions that happen very fast on your face. And then their behaviour is triggered by that micro expression. Once that behaviour is triggered, if they go outside of their window of tolerance, then to be able to reattune to any changed expression is very difficult for them. So an example might be if child's in the kitchen, they've dropped something, it's all over the floor. You come in, you see broken glass everywhere, and they're standing on the edge of the broken glass and there's stuff all over the floor. Your micro expression might be, oh my gosh. And then even though you recover that and go, oh, accidents happen, their behavior is responding to the micro expression of, oh my gosh, and they're already moving outside of their window of tolerance because they've already been sitting right at the top of their window. And when sitting right at the top of their window, it's so easy to move out of their window. And then it's more difficult to come back in when they see your change to, it's okay, let's work together to clean it up. The next one down here is power and control issues. And I think this is a really commonly reported behaviour and seen as a negative behaviour of the child, or they're trying to control everything, they're manipulating. This is because they have very little control in their universe, and control is equal to providing their own consistency. So if they control a situation, then they know what's going to happen next. If they're out of control in the situation, then they're not actually able to predict. So that creates more anxiety and they're further outside of the window. Sadness, grief, and loss is an important one because every child, whether they've been removed at birth or any time, if they've gone, if they've been restored and then come back into care, or if they've moved placements, there's always sadness, grief, and loss. That's a given. And as I spoke about before, attachment relationships are not, the attachment isn't about love. The attachment is about safety. So they can still feel the grief and loss for the parent because there may have been love there, but they may not be attached to the parent because there was no safety there. So there's still going to be an element of that grief and loss. Recreating negative but familiar environments. So this is about putting themselves in a space where they're familiar. And I think you can come from that as being better the devil you know. So, and we see that with adolescents as well. If we're looking at children moving into adolescence, they tend to recreate that negative but familiar environment. Blocked trust. Blocked trust is when there is that block between the child and their ability to trust the caregiver because they haven't had the consistency before. A lack of empathy, and we do see this a lot in children with trauma histories because the empathy is developing somewhere around the middle of that brain. So if we've already got a difficult brain stem, we're not very regulated, we're going outside of the window, there's a lot of internal self-focus, so empathy can be really difficult for children. A fear of invisibility, not being noticed, so there's lots of acting out or competing behaviours. Compulsion to break forming attachments. Well, forming trust when trust has been broken many times can be scary. And if we think about as adults, if we haven't been lucky enough to find our life partner first go round, finding second time or third time or fourth time or fifth time or however many time can get more difficult as you go along, because there's already this element of trust being broken. So if your relationship broke down because the other person cheated, then trying to find the next relationship is going to be that much harder, because then there's the possibility that that person could do the same thing. So to give yourself over to somebody can be really hard if you've already had your trust broken once before, leave alone twice, 3 times, or multiple times. So around that 3-month mark, kids that have had lots and lots of placements might start pushing the boundary to break those attachments, because if they're in control of that, so going back to those power and control issues, they know what's coming. They can start to predict the next move rather than pushing through and building that relationship. Impulsivity is often reported, and that is because of that window thing. They're constantly flipping their lid. They're not in the cortex. They're unable to be in the cortex. So there's lots of impulsive behaviour. Lack of remorse is something that is reported, and it may not necessarily be lack of remorse, but it may be an overbearing sense of shame that they're not willing to connect with. So not appearing remorseful, but also if they've been victim to a lot of trauma, being the perpetrator of trauma may come back to that power and control as well. We have anger. I think, we all know what it feels like to be angry, and they've got plenty of reason to be angry by this point. Sensory issues. Sensory issues can come right from that early brainstem development. So our feeling of hot and cold, whether we're hot or cold. If anybody's had any children in the care or worked with any children that have walked around like it's the last rose of summer in the middle of winter because they haven't been able to sense the cold, they tend to get coughs and colds very easily because they're not actually able to body regulate, and that comes right down to that brainstem. So thinking about that time in utero exposed to stress and trauma. Interoception, so that's what I was talking about in terms of the you and the me and the we. It's very difficult to be able to build relationship and find that we part in between. Consistently high levels of cortisol, and that comes down to stress. So if your body is in alarm state all of the time, it's releasing cortisol to help cope with that, and they're sitting right on the top of their window, right up here. So there's consistently high levels. And literalness. So everything you say is exactly how you say it. There's no grey area, and we see that because it's that whole not able to sit in the cortex to unpack that, or we may have poor horizontal and vertical integration that helps us make sense of the whole situation that's happening around them. Okay, so they're just some common behaviours. Some might take you off guard straight up because you're not used to that parenting average children, but they're very common behaviours of children that have experienced a significant amount of trauma. Okay, so this is the models that we use in therapeutic parenting. So on the left side, I've got Dan Hughes's PACE model: playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And on the other side, I've got the therapeutic parenting triangle. So the bottom part is about understanding the cause of the exhibited behaviours. And that's really what we've talked about so far this morning, understanding how the brain is made and how the brain is built for those children that have experienced trauma, because when we can understand what's happened for them, and whether that be in a literal sense of knowing exactly what their trauma is, or whether it's about understanding in a global perspective that being exposed to anything in utero, including their maternal stress or their maternal experience of trauma in their DNA, it helps us to understand why and what's happening. I guess there's more discrete behaviours that children exhibit, like, for example, screaming when it's time to have a bath because their particular trauma might have occurred in the bath. We might not know those things until those particular triggers play out, but in terms of general behaviour, meltdowns and cue reading really comes from globally developmental trauma. The next layer on this triangle is about the structure, routine, and firm boundaries. So being really clear about what the expectations are to begin with, and understanding what that looks like in the home environment first. So if the structure and the routine is really tight, then it provides safety for those children. The next one is nurture, and that's that helping the child to receive nurture and learning what nurture feels like. Next one is empathy. I'm going to talk more about that soon. And then reflection. So being able to look at what's happening and understand what's happening. And you know, it's a two-way kind of model. It's, you know, nurture empathy and reflection for the child's behaviour, but it's also nurture empathy and reflection for you as well as a caregiver. Because if we can look back on what was the incident, what happened, what was the child's response, what was my response, what does the theory say, or what's the advice on that situation, and then what can I do differently next time, helps us to think about each scenario in a calmer space to be able to approach it differently next time it comes around. Okay, so this one is a model that is developed in relation to the intervention in incidences. So this might be in the moment of the meltdown, it might be a meltdown, it might be something, done something specific, and it's kind of your little go-to kind of list of things to do in that space. So the first one is to pause, to respond, and I guess we can go back to the brain model for ourselves. If we're responding in our lower brain, we're responding with an action, we're responding with a facial expression, we're responding with something else. So meeting the incident and taking the breath and pausing allows us to reconnect our cortex to our lower brain. And we can start thinking in our cortex about how can we respond. So to respond consciously, not emotionally, and step back mentally and physically. We need to assess if there's any immediate danger to anyone or any serious damage that can occur. What is actually happening? What's happening in this moment, and where is the child coming from? What is going on for them in that space? And then empathize. So expressing empathy for the difficulty that that child is experiencing in that moment. Offer nurture, touch, or just being present, or a drink or something in that space. So if it's a child's broken something, it might have been purposely, it might have been accidentally, but just offering some nurture in that moment to, or a drink to reground and bring them back up back into their window of tolerance. Think about what other strategies might resolve this. Is there a natural consequence? Can I name the need? What can I change to avoid this happening in the future? So I guess if it was breaking something precious, keeping precious things out of the way. But if it's breaking something of their own that was precious, the natural consequence is that it's broken and they don't have that anymore. So that can happen in this situation. And then what can I do to make myself feel better? Because you need to recover in order to reattune with the child, because we're not saints. We can't live in this space and respond perfectly to everything 24/7, and needing to look after yourself in that space to be able to respond in a way that is useful for the child in that space, but then also take care of yourself, because if it's something that's affected you personally, then you need to be able to do that in your own space. Okay, so here's a list of a whole different bunch of strategies. And just going to refer to my notes on each of those ones. So identifying our own triggers can help us out, because if you've got a child that knows your triggers, then if they want to cause pain because they're in pain, then they're looking for those triggers. And that can also trigger us into an overreaction of what happens and how we respond to the child. Now, a child may be looking for any response. So one that's an over response will then reinforce past behaviours and keep them continuing on that trajectory of behaviour. So setting expectations, we need to make sure that our expectations are consistent with the child's capabilities and the emotional age. Just because we're parenting a 12-year-old, it doesn't mean that their emotional age is a 12-year-old. Their emotional age is usually stuck back at the time of the trauma. So if they experienced an enormous amount of trauma at 4, their emotional age might be 4. If they experienced an enormous amount of early trauma, their emotional age may be 2. And the way that the expectations we have of them may be more consistent with what we have of a 2-year-old. So thinking about what is the child capable of and what is their emotional age. Now, something that comes up often in training, just give me a minute. Here's when there's been a reward set. So if they can hold their behaviour for a particular few days to meet a particular reward, and they meet that reward, and then the next day their behaviour is terrible. Often the response that I get from carers is, but they have the capacity to meet, those 3 days so they can get something, and then the next day it all goes incredibly wrong. So they can do it. So why aren't they keeping doing it? Well, they're not keeping doing it because they're sitting in the top of their window of tolerance. So the minute the pressure's off, the valve opens. So it's best not to have that milestone that they have to work towards, but just a consistent expectation that's within their capabilities just to get through a day, and one day at a time. Setting expectations a few days ahead of let's have good behaviour for the next 3 days, that's actually going to create some stress, and then you'll get to the 3rd day and everything will go pear-shaped because they're actually not emotionally able to sustain it, and they might be pushing themselves, but as soon as they've reached that point, it's like the valve breaks. So you're best to choose a couple of things for the day that are achievable that you can work for without any kind of major goals to work up to. So just to reiterate, there's a lot of things that we consider they should be doing for their age, but they're actually not doing that at that point because of their emotional age. So the next one is time in. So when we want children to regulate, and we do want them to regulate, But because they haven't learnt to co-regulate, so thinking back to a couple of webinars when we talked about co-regulation being that thing that babies learn when they look at us and we smile and we meet their needs by changing nappies, feeding, rocking, patting, singing, all of those things, they haven't learnt to co-regulate. So they actually need us to regulate. So sending them to a room or time out or to be separate makes it really difficult for the child because they don't actually have anyone to regulate from. So time in is more helpful and will help them regulate more than to be put into time out. So something that might be useful in this spot is to ask the child to help you with something, including putting things right. So drop something that's broken, there's a little nurture, it's okay, it's accepting, let's work together to tidy it up. It will be okay. Or I can see you're feeling a little wobbly right now. I think you need to stay close to me for a little while. Just for them to sense from you, which does mean that you actually need to maintain the regulation in that space, but so they can sense from you that regulation to then be able to move on. The next one is about accepting the child, and this is part of Dan Hughes' PACE. So the A in PACE is acceptance, and it's about thinking about this child separate from their behaviour. So they've broken something. The instant kind of feeling in us is, oh my gosh, that was really important to me and I'm going to cry. But we've taken the step back, we've taken the breath, and we're going to say, I'm really glad you weren't hurt. You're important to me. I'm accepting you as a human and an important part of my life. I'm really glad that you didn't hurt yourself when that happened, because we're accepting them as the child and looking at the behaviour very separately. So when I was travelling around the state and doing some training in one of the regional areas, a foster carer had talked about this lovely boy that they had been caring for a long time and still continue to do so, and how he actually set a fire in his bedroom. And he said, of course, you know, coming out of the house, wanted to say that the child was a psychopath and had all of these behaviours and didn't want them in the home anymore, and very understandably. And when asking what was the response, my response was to say to the child, I'm really glad you're okay. I don't know what I would have done if you were hurt in this situation. That's a really, really hard thing to do. And it does mean that we need to also have the person that we can go to separately to comfort us in the terms of the, well, my house has been burnt down or my favorite thing has been broken, to be able to let that out because it needs to happen in a separate space. The more that we do this, the more that we accept the child, the better the child feels about themselves, and then the less this behaviour continues. So the only way to get this behaviour to change is flip it on its head and work with accepting the child first. So using silliness or playfulness, and some of the easiest ways to stop a child is to be a bit silly or playful. They can't experience joy and fear at the same time. So if there is the opportunity to play, their fight-flight reflex will stop and they'll engage in play. So Nerf balls, any of those soft balls, being able to throw them around, throwing cushions around, being a bit silly or playful in the moment is really useful to de-escalate. Starting to sing silly songs, that modulation in your voice going up and down is really regulative for a child and can be silly. Using touch and parental presence to regulate. And I just want to use that, you know, when we think about newborn babies, little babies, when they're crying in their cot, we pick them up, we hold them tight, and we pat. So that's using touch. That helps us regulate. That's how they learn to regulate, from that touch. So often children that have challenging behaviours and have developmental trauma, they may not be able to tolerate touch. But another way they could tolerate that might be using a weighted blanket, or getting them to sit on the lounge next to you and put something over them, where they're using some kind of firmness to be able to hold them in that space, and just being present with them can be helpful. So working out what that kind of thing can be that can apply pressure to them to help with that touch. Removing the audience, or anybody that doesn't need to be present in this situation, can move away. And the reason why we do that is because an audience creates shame. Using curiosity, so that's the C in PACE. Thinking about, I'm wondering why this is happening right now. I'm hoping that you can tell me what's happening for you, or something like that to help. An example is, what do you think was going on, or what do you think that was about? And just looking at what feelings could have been there. So the next one says showing sorry. And, asking a child to say sorry can be really, really difficult for them, because it is linked to shame. It's linked to an enormous amount of shame. And there's some fantastic clips on shame from both Brené Brown and Dan Hughes on YouTube. You can just search shame and one of those two. And it's really about getting them to act out the sorry instead of getting them to say sorry. We often get children to come up and say to the other child, sorry. There's a lot of shame in that. So for a child with developmental trauma, that's compounded. So saying something like, this is an example straight from Sarah Nash. Oh, I see you've tipped your sister's juice on the floor. Here's a cloth so you can help me clear it up. And then giving positive reinforcement for the right behaviour that they did in that space, instead of nagging at the poor behaviour, giving them the opportunity to rectify the situation going on, and then encouraging the positive behaviour in rectifying that. Using distraction. So watch what the child's doing, rather than saying that, avoiding reacting to what the child's saying, and then looking at seeing if you can shift them. So throwing balls around, changing topics, changing activities, something like that can distract from them, from the situation that they're in. And watching what the child is doing rather than what they are saying. So ignoring all of the words that are coming out, but watching what the actual actions are. Sometimes, and it leads on to the next one about naming the need. If we can see what they're actually doing, we can name what they might actually need in that, rather than listening to the words that may be a mismatch between the behaviour and the words. Repairing mistakes. And I think this one is important for us, because there's no such thing as a perfect therapeutic parent. Nobody can be this 24/7. We all have our bad days. Some days are going to be worse than others. And when our emotions overwhelm us, then it's really about trying not to do any harm. So walking away quickly in the opposite direction may be the best option that you have in that time to be able to help in that situation, and to take care of yourself before responding. Okay, so this slide is about the responses and strategies to avoid. So obviously we're going to avoid any kind of smacking or hitting. It doesn't fit with therapeutic parenting at all. It also doesn't fit with the code of conduct, and we spoke about that last week. Forcing compliance. We don't want to keep on doing something until they actually engage with that, it's not going to help. And if anything, that control and power behaviour is going to come out, and they're going to be less likely to do it. We can't hold on to the child and force them to move where we want them to be. It will actually activate that child's fear response rather than following with you and doing what they need to do. Blaming and shaming, so reminding a child that they did something, saying that in front of others, it's actually going to reinforce the child's behaviour, and you're going to have very little likely of changing that. Insisting on the truth, not telling the truth, and we will have a webinar coming up probably in July on dealing with lying behaviour and how this is impacted in out-of-home care. But insisting that they say the truth is actually reactivating that blame characteristic, and it's also impacting on their control and power dynamic as well. And insisting on the truth is actually probably going to push them further away, and they'll maintain their position quite adamantly. So asking why they have behaved a certain way is not overly useful, because often they actually don't know. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And saying something, asking them why they did something, is basically saying, I have no idea why you do what you do, and I'm no longer a safe adult to be around. So yeah, they won't know the answer to why, because we're up outside of window of tolerance. We want to avoid surprises and spontaneity. So anybody that has a trauma history will know that they don't like surprise parties, and they don't like things unannounced. They like things structured. So even though we think it might be a nice thing, we want to avoid any kind of surprises or spontaneity. It might seem that that's pretty dull, but a surprise to us might actually equate to fear for the child. They need to be planned, they need to be predicted, or they need to know what's coming. Obviously, over-punishing and unrelated consequences, things need to be dealt with in situ in the time. And if we're concentrating on this, then we're actually taking away from what the child needs in that time. Following the child. This is an important one, and it's one I've come across with a few children in out-of-home care that are a little bit older. So they'll walk away, and I observed this once when I was working with a child in a school, and the teacher was following and continued to keep talking to him, and he just needed to be away to be able to regulate himself. So if they need space, then we need to give them space. That is different to time out. If it's self-imposed and they choose to go and have some space, then that's okay. That's what they need to be able to regulate. We shouldn't be sending any child to be alone. This would be like leaving a crying baby to sort themselves out. It's excluding the child and isolating them. And basically in that time, they sit with their shame. The other thing that they may sit with in that time is planning revenge. So if you put them in timeout, they may spend that time in terms of their overdeveloped sense of fairness of what's happening for me is not fair, therefore I need to do something else to right the wrong, which then can come out as a revenge kind of behaviour. Planned ignoring and withdrawal. There may be times when you just need to put your own time out in, go to your own room, but actually planning to ignore a child and withdrawing from them, that equates to blocked care. So we need to try and avoid that wherever we can. Discussions about the behaviour. This one's a tricky one, because I guess when you watch Super Nanny or something like that, they sit on the step and then have the discussion about what did you do wrong and how are you going to do it differently and say sorry and all of those kinds of things. From a trauma lens, this doesn't work. it just reinstills that sense of shame, and they often don't know why they did what they did. They did it outside of their window. So having lengthy discussions about it can actually just make the situation worse, and it takes away from that being accepting. Making a child say sorry, we just talked about, or the sympathetic face. So I'm just going to read a little bit about the sympathetic face. So an empathic expression, either verbally stated or mirrored, is quite different from a sympathetic face. These children are hardwired to survive and therefore constantly analysing our faces. If they appear to think that we're feeling sorry for them, then that's going to escalate them even more. If we're sitting in and feeling with them, it's a very different kind of face. But the feeling sorry for actually creates a bigger distance between us and the child, and they're more likely to act out and not feel like you're safe because it's judging and that feeling of blame. And obviously using food removal as a punishment, that's absolutely a no, given it also fits with code of conduct behaviour as well. We can't do that as well. So that's a lot of no you can'ts on the end of all the yes you cans. But yeah, I just wanted to put it out there now. I'll unmute everybody. So if you've got background noise, just be mindful, you might want to turn yourself off. But wondering if anybody's got any questions around anything said so far. I've done an unmute all, but I'm not sure. Yes, everyone can talk now if they choose to do so.
I would like to ask,
Sure.
what if a child has been forced to eat? How do we handle a situation where children have fear of food?
So is there food that they're actually eating for you by choice now?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
But,
they've been forced to eat other food in the past, which is becoming restrictive?
They've been forced to eat their meals
Mm-hmm.
when maybe they haven't wanted them.
Yeah.
And that has created a difficulty with being adventuresome with foods, staying with what foods are safe for them. Yes, it's something I don't know how to handle. I'm doing the best in giving them the foods that they will eat and trying to give them a balanced diet, but at the same time it can be quite difficult.
Yeah, it can be. So it might be a little bit, how old are they?
They're 5 and 7.
Yeah, so they're getting to an age now, I'm not sure about their emotional age, but they're getting to an age now where they can start to understand some of the psychoeducation about healthy eating. And there's some good infographics on what a plate should look like in terms of colours or food groups. And it might be worth doing some activities with them to choose food that fit into those food groups, so they can see that what they're eating, so they're choosing what they're eating, but they can see that it fits into the food groups that they need to have in a day. Right. It is, they are going to be super restrictive, and I guess, you know, the clear rules around you don't have to eat everything on your plate. No. But it might be like, it would be really good if you tried something new, even just one mouthful, but you're probably going to have to work from there. How long have they been with you now?
Well, full time for about 15 months.
Yeah,
and
so still early days.
Still early days, although the older one has been with me a considerable amount of time, but always returned to the trauma situation.
Yeah. So it's still early days, and you might just be working on continually giving them a new template of you don't have to eat everything on your plate so far.
Yes.
Before introducing, but giving them a range of things that they maybe choose to introduce or try, and see if you can make some kind of game of it of, okay, each week I'm going to try a new food and get them to choose one that could be integrated into a meal, and they don't have to eat it, but it'd be really good if they tried it.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
That'll keep you busy, Barbara.
Very busy.
Good. Is there anything coming from anyone else? I've just had a thank you, but they need to go. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to ask? Okay, it doesn't sound like it. What I might do now is stop the recording and we'll finish up for today.